All right, joining me now from the other side of the aisle, Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Senator, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you, Shannon.
You've already ruled out running for president this time, so I don't have to ask you about that. Okay, so the debt deal comes together. You clearly are worried about the defense spending. You offered an amendment that didn't go anywhere in the Senate on that front. But the Washington Post has this piece that says basically, Senate GOP folks, you ceded your authority to argue about this. It says this: it's almost as if the Senate GOP had not been paying attention. As negotiations began a couple of weeks ago, McCarthy did not have the same protect the Pentagon ethos as the vast majority of Senate Republicans. So do you wish now that Senate GOP leaders had been more involved in these negotiations?
No, Shannon. First off, I want to commend Kevin McCarthy for overcoming President Biden's irresponsible, stubborn position that there'd be no negotiations at all. When you have divided government, obviously you have to have negotiations and compromise, and because you have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, it was always going to be Speaker McCarthy and President Biden driving those. I and other senators stayed in touch with House negotiators. We gave our input on it. I'm pleased at some of the successes, like the reduction in spending or the permitting reforms. I wish it would have gone a little bit further. I don't think that we need to stay at the post-pandemic levels of spending. I think we could easily go back to pre-pandemic levels of domestic spending. But I am deeply worried about the cuts to defense in this legislation. There's three different kinds of cuts. First, the cut this year, you're going to have probably 2 to 3% cut after inflation.
But just so we clarify that, there is more money there.
There's more money, but it's only 3% more when you have inflation running at 5 or 6%.
It doesn't match.
So in reality, you're going to have an actual cut. And then next year, there's only a 1% increase. I don't think Joe Biden's going to get inflation next year down to 1%. So you're going to have another cut. And then maybe worst of all is the way it sets up a 1% automatic spending cut across the board. And the way that was written is if that Congress doesn't do its work by September 30th, domestic spending will actually go up. It won't be a 1% cut from what this bill proposed. Domestic spending will go up. That means that Chuck Schumer has an incentive to ball up the appropriations process this fall because the Democrats get more domestic spending while the Pentagon takes a real cut. At a time when dangers are gathering with China and Iran and Russia, I think it's very risky for our country to be imposing real cuts on the Department of Defense.
Yeah, and I want to try to get to some of those, but I want to talk about this. I talked with somebody very intimately involved with these negotiations who said if people are worried about defense spending, they should go back and find the waste and fraud in the Pentagon because it's there. This headline from The Equation says this: defense spending reaches record high as Pentagon fails its audit for the 5th time. They note that what weakens our defense is a waste, fraud, and redundancy issue, but instead of demanding responsible financial management, Congress gives the Department of Defense more money year after year. Where do we go? I mean, if we think that there are millions, possibly billions in wasted money within the Pentagon, they failed their audit 5 times in a row. Is there money there that could be helpful to these concerns you have?
There's no question there's opportunities for the Pentagon to reform, especially around the way it procures weapon systems. However, if you're talking millions and billions in reform, we're talking about tens of billions at a minimum in additional needs to deter China and deter Iran, deter Russia. We've seen this happen in the past. In the Trump era, secretaries were able to find savings, and then those savings were turned back into procurement of more aircraft and ships and vehicles. It happened with Bob Gates in the Obama era, but Barack Obama double-crossed Bob Gates and just took all that money that he had found for savings for domestic priorities. So there's no question the Pentagon can find savings, but not savings to match and offset the cuts in this bill or the threats that we face from countries like China and Iran and Russia.
Could you give Democrats more domestic spending if there were a way to get more defense spending for you, say in another authorization for Ukraine or some other vehicle?
Well, there's already been a lot of domestic spending increases. I mean, over the last 2 years, we saw over $3 trillion of new spending from the Democrats. If you look at defense, though, you mentioned the absolute dollars are going up. That's true at face value, but I just want to make 2 points. The first is that, again, it's going to be falling in real dollars after you account for Joe Biden's inflation. And second, when you compare what we spend on our military to the size of our economy, we are reaching record lows now. It's going to fall to levels not seen since the Clinton administration, when we took a misguided holiday from history thinking there'd be no more threats facing America. So when you see the military declining as a proportion of our economy, yet at the same time you see threats rising from China and Iran and Russia, I think it poses a grave danger for our nation's future.
I want to try to get to a couple of of those. So quickly on China, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is over in Singapore. Chinese counterparts don't want to meet with him there. They refuse that. We've had these incursions with a Chinese jet, and now with warships in the Taiwan Strait. Some aggressive behavior there. But there's talk that this administration is looking at potentially lifting some tariffs and saying we have to do better with communication between these two countries. I mean, how are we doing managing that relationship?
Well, Biden administration officials should stop chasing after their Chinese communist counterparts like love-struck teenagers. It's embarrassing and it's pathetic. In fact, it projects weakness to China. It encourages them to do things like buzz our aircraft or come within a few hundred yards of our ships. It encourages them to send spy balloons floating all across America. Reducing those tariffs would send the same message. And to get back to this bill that we just voted on, the single best way we can deter China and Iran and Russia is to have a military capable of deterring them. That's one of the core lessons of history. If you look at, say, World War I and World War II, there were a lot of misguided diplomatic decisions that led to those wars, but fundamentally it was disarmament by countries like Great Britain and the United States that encouraged German ambitions and then ultimately aggression.
Quickly, I want to ask you about the situation with North Korea. Their public health minister has now been elected to a board in the World Health Organization. President Trump on social media congratulated Kim Jong-un on that. So a couple of things. What does it say about WHO that North Korea now has a position on this executive board? And should any, American, including a former president, be congratulating Kim Jong-un for anything?
Well, the World Health Organization, like many of these international organizations, often elevate and allow dictatorial regimes to make decisions for them on these panels. It's not just the World Health Organization either. It's China, of all places, running the World Intellectual Property Organization, or countries like Syria or Cuba or Libya or North Korea being on the United Nations Human Rights Council. That's part of the problem with all these international organizations. And I would not congratulate Kim Jong-un or any other of these dictatorial regimes for the roles they play in these international organizations, especially ones like the World Health Organization that have been so harmful to American interest over the last 3 years in the way that they basically ran interference for any investigation to the origins of the Chinese coronavirus.
All right. So, Senator, we appreciate your time. Much more we could discuss. So come back.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.